at what the future holds for our coastal communities. Kelly, thanks for coming to talk to us about this. How much have our sea levels risen already, and how much more will continue if nothing is done?
Well, if you go back to about 1920, so for the last 100 years or so, they've risen only about an inch, actually, and that's this line right here. So going 1920, here we are today, but the projection, at least in this report going forward, the gauge observations showing that increase tripling. I mean, we're talking 3 inches per decade all the way through the year 2100 due to temperature increase, melting of ice sheets, of course, adding to that water volume. And we've had coastal storms, as you guys know, more frequent, stronger coastal storms exacerbating the flooding along the coastline like we see in Charleston in South Carolina and even South Florida, king tides.
Yeah.
How often are we showing flooding down there in South
sunny
Florida?
day flooding too. You don't
That's
even need a storm, you know?
Exactly.
Now, when we look at this, obviously outside the spectrum, but are there any specific areas that are hit harder? You mentioned Miami, you mentioned Charleston. Anywhere else that we could talk about?
And by the way, this report is showing a high confidence in this line, which is pretty drastic. I just want to point that out. But if you look at this next chart, we're showing where it's going to be worse along the Atlantic coast versus the Pacific coast. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, the top
right?
Okay.
You got a lot of ecosystems.
The symmetry,
You got the Northeast looking at a rise of 1 to 2 feet, but especially here in the western Gulf of Mexico, Houston, the coastline of Louisiana, where of course we're below sea level, a place like New Orleans. So the worry here is that these ecosystems are reaching their tipping point at this point. And, you know, this affects fisheries. You've got tourism, recreation, transportation, energy, all of these things being impacted by that water rise at the coast.
Yeah, the report does offer a path for the future. So what can we do now to reduce?
Basically, one other thing I want to point out, by the way, is Alaska, a lower rise, like it's not rising at all. It's actually going the other way around, and that's because of tectonic plate activity, where you have, you know, these are rising, these are land areas that are rising up out of the ocean. So I just want to point that out. But yeah, there are things that we can do. The report does state that we should be using planned relocation strategies, natural solutions as well. You know, a lot of people want to build along the coastline, but how many millionaires, even politicians, still want to build on the coastline? So that's something that we need to look at, right? And just clean energy overall, cleaning up the environment, getting more and more people into that sector, which takes education and incentives, too, for people to want to go into that kind of work environment.
All right, so let's kind of look at something on the Gulf world.
How hot it got in the Gulf of Mexico, and especially in the Keys.
It was
sea surface temperatures were more like a hot tub. It was well into the 90s. So coral was unfortunately going through bleaching and therefore dying. So these researchers decided to remove 360 corals and bring them to a climate-controlled lab in Florida and basically protect them there until they were able to put them back to their offshore coral nurseries.
We're going to have to do that every year now?
Well, that's the problem. You don't want to have to keep doing this over and over again. So when we were talking to the researchers, we did this interview over the weekend, they're like, yes, it actually solved the problem. They were definitely nursed back to health when they were put back in the water, but you don't want to have to do this.
You don't have to do that every year.
You know, this is a problem. This is not going to sustain going forward.
All right. Meteorologist Kelly Cass, we really appreciate that. And super interesting, right? Who knew they're going to pluck the coral out, save it, and then
who knew Alaska would go negative?
I know, that's really cool. That is actually super cool, Kelly.